Hi everyone, my name is Brandon Carroll and welcome to my course, Cisco ISE Guest Access for CCNP Security 300-208 SISAS. I am a CCIE in Security and Consulting Engineer at Global Config Technology Solutions. In this course, we're going to learn about how to configure Cisco ISE for guest access. This is really important because so many organizations are using this technology to manage their guest lifecycle. Having these skills makes you very marketable in today's environments. Some of the major topics that we will cover include how web authentication works in a Cisco environment that's deploying Cisco ISE, how to configure web authentication and make sure we can test its functionality, how to add that guest access element by creating a sponsor portal that employees can log into and create guest accounts, and how to test and verify guest access in your Cisco ISE environment. By the end of this course, you'll know how guest access works and, most importantly, the configuration steps required to make it happen. Before beginning this course, you should be familiar with the Cisco ISE, and I highly recommend that you view the Introduction to Cisco ISE for CCNP Security 300-208 SISAS, as well as Advanced Access Control with Cisco ISE for CCNP Security 300-208 SISAS courses, because these courses set up the foundation for what we'll be covering right here in this course. From here, you should feel comfortable diving into posture and profiling services with courses on Cisco ISE Posture Services, Cisco ISE Profiling Services, and Cisco ISE BYOD. I hope you'll join me on this journey to learn guest access with Cisco ISE right here in the Cisco ISE Guest Access for CCNP Security 300-208 SISAS course at Pluralsight. Well, hi there everyone, and welcome to Cisco ISE Guest Access for CCNP Security 300-208 SISAS. My name is Brandon Carroll, CCIE number 23837, and this is your course introduction, and we're also going to get into web authentication. Let's take a look at the high-level list of topics that we're going to discuss as we progress through this course. Well, we're going to start out by reviewing the topology that we'll be working with. And you know, this topology is something that's been used in the other courses that are a part of this series. So, you might be familiar with this topology already. If not, we're going to review it. And after we get into a little bit of a review of the topology, we're going to overview web authentication. And so we'll just shorten that phrase. We'll call it web auth. Most people would know what you were talking about if you used that phrase. So we're going to get into the world of web auth here. We'll discuss the general web auth process. And as we go through this process, we'll examine a scenario. We'll see how the scenario plays out. And then we're going to focus on a very specific aspect of web authentication, and that is what's known as central web auth. And so we'll explain the details as we get to that portion of this module. Then we're going to talk about the process that's involved in configuring web authentication, and we'll go through a demonstration on how to do that. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our topology. Well, let's just take a couple minutes here and review the topology that we're going to be working with throughout this guest access course. And we've changed things up just a tad bit from the previous courses and sort of streamlined things a little bit. So we're going to start out with a firewall. So this is our Cisco ASA. And on the outside of that firewall, we'll be connected to a router that'll get us out to the internet, basic connectivity at this point. Now there is a server hanging off of a DMZ. We'll call that the DMZ server. And then on the inside of our firewall, we have the HQ switch. This will be the primary switch that we'll be configuring and working with when we do our guest authentication. Now we have an employee PC, a guest PC, and a printer all connected inside that HQ switch. And then also hanging off of that HQ switch, we also have our Active Directory server. That will be our domain controller, and that's at 10.10.3.10. And then hanging off of the management network of our ASA, we have ISE, which is going to be 10.10.2.20. And then we also have an admin PC that we'll be using to access ISE and do any of that additional stuff that we need to do. So this gives us just a little bit of an overview of what the topology looks like. We don't really need to get into a whole lot of details. Essentially what we'll be doing is working with the admin PC as we configure ISE. We'll be going onto the command line of the HQ switch, and we'll be testing from our guest PC and our employee PC. Primarily our guest PC in this particular course, because we're going to be providing guest access. Now we may do some things from the employee PC as well, but again, primarily we're talking about guest access. Now that guest PC could be a wireless machine, but in this case, for the purposes of the CCNP security and the SISAS exam, we're working with wired access pretty much for everything. All the concepts that we learn here will hold true, though, even if we were to go over to a wireless network. So same concepts when we talk about guest access and how all of this stuff gets provisioned. Okay, well that's it. Let's go ahead and do a bit of an overview of web authentication and take a look at our scenario, what we're trying to accomplish here. Well, I guess I should mention here that web authentication is something that is very popular. In fact, you've probably experienced web authentication as a client, perhaps at an airport, perhaps at your favorite coffee shop. Whatever the case may be, web authentication, or just WebAuth for that matter, is a very commonly used tool to provide web access for someone who needs a little more than just open access. So in this section here, we're going to look at WebAuth, and we're going to offer you a scenario, the common WebAuth scenario. We'll also take a look at some of the types of WebAuth that we might see in different network environments. So first of all, web authentication is a means of providing AAA, now that stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting, via a web portal. So anyone who's familiar with a network environment where some type of security is in place will likely be familiar with the requirement to provide usernames and passwords when you access network devices. We deploy a TACACS server in our Cisco networks in most cases to provide authentication to those network devices. When we configure it on a Cisco router, it's very common that we set up the command AAA new model. And then from there we can set up our rules on how we're going to authenticate. Well, in this scenario with AAA, we're going to do it via a web portal. We're still going to authenticate a user. We're still going to authorize a user. And guess what? We're still going to account for that user, but we're going to do it inside of a web portal because really they don't want to gain access to our network devices. They want to gain access to the internet. Now, this is often used for visitors. You probably already know that, but I have to say it here. This is a common method of authenticating a visitor to our network and making sure that somebody's not just doing a drive-by of our office space, connecting to our Wi-Fi and uploading or downloading whatever they want. They've got to kind of have some credentials here. Another scenario, I mentioned earlier in this module, is the 802.1x fallback. So let's say we connect to a wired network and we try to authenticate, but it fails. Well, in this case, we can use it as a fallback.
Not necessarily just because it fails, but perhaps we don't have a client installed yet. Okay, so that's another aspect of this WebAuth. Here's another one. It's HTTP or HTTPS redirection to a portal. Well, what are we talking about there? Well, in order to provide WebAuth to a user, they've got to open their web browser. So the user opens a web browser, they try to connect to something, and they need to be redirected. So our network access device is going to play a part in that, as well as ISE, in sending a URL as a redirect to the user for them to be put into a captive portal where they can now enter their credentials. And finally, just as mentioned already, we'll say it again here, this does not only apply to wireless networks. We commonly see it in wireless networks, but we might also see this on a wired network as well. Okay, let's talk about our scenario. So we'll go ahead and lay out this scenario in very simple terms. I don't want you to focus too much on physical topology or anything for that matter that deals with all that connectivity. But essentially, here's what happens. We have a user that comes on and they're redirected to a portal. Their access to the corporate network is going to be blocked. And the only traffic that's going to be allowed through that wireless controller based on access rules is going to be traffic to that WebAuth portal. So in other words, in our environment, it's going to be only allowing access to the Cisco ISE address. Now let's take this a step further. That ISE access is to the ISE PSN. Now in a distributed deployment, we have a primary admin node, perhaps a secondary admin node. We have monitoring nodes, and then we have policy service nodes, or PSNs. Those are the ones that are handling the real-time transactions with our users. And that's where these WebAuth redirects are going to go to, the PSN that is servicing the real-time traffic. I mention this because in a distributed deployment, you're going to make sure that your access list is permitting traffic to any of those PSNs in case one of them fails and our NAD rolls over to the secondary device, the secondary PSN. We want that to be allowed as well. Far too many times I've seen production networks where the access list only includes their primary service node and they don't include the other PSNs in the network. And then a failover takes place and all of a sudden nobody can WebAuth. So keep that in mind. Now, after a user authenticates, then they're going to gain controlled access to the corporate network. And again, in this scenario, the wireless controller is what's providing that access to the corporate network by means of an access list. We'll configure this access list in our ISE GUI interface. And once that user authenticates as a guest or as an employee, depending on how they authenticate, then we'll go ahead and push down those rules to the controller. The controller will apply that access list, and then the user's traffic can flow based on what's allowed in that access list. Now, what I've overviewed in this scenario for you is what's known as central WebAuth, but there are other WebAuth types, and you do need to be familiar with them. So central web authentication, or as we would just abbreviate it, CWA, is where we centralize the authentication process on a device like ISE. Now, this has not been something that we've done for a really long time. In fact, in earlier implementations of web authentication, we would do what's known as local web authentication. Now, with local web authentication, the big difference here is that either the wireless controller or the switch whichever device is acting as the network access device, or the NAD, for that client to connect, that device would be presenting them with the web browser. And so they would have to run a local web server to be able to deliver up that authentication page. Now, another thing to mention about local web authentication is you would have to configure that on all of your switches that would have clients connected, or you would have to configure that on all of your controllers that are going to have clients connected. And so this adds to the workload, so to speak. Well, it really does add to the workload. So we don't really prefer local WebAuth these days. Central WebAuth is the more scalable solution. But that doesn't mean that we won't see local WebAuth. However, for this course, SISAS, for that exam, you're not going to be tested on local web authentication. And I'll tell you what, that makes a lot of sense, because Central WebAuth is provided by Cisco ISE, and the SISAS exam is primarily focused on providing authentication with ISE, authorization with ISE, posturing with ISE, and so on. Okay, so one other WebAuth type that you should be familiar with, and that is known as device registration WebAuth. And in device registration WebAuth, what we'd be talking about here is simply the ability to register the MAC address of your device with ISE or with a central database. After registering that address, then you have some control on whether you lose the device or not. You can put it into a lost mode, which would then apply some access rules to block it. Those are the three WebAuth types to discuss here. Again, we're going to focus on Central WebAuth. Now let's go into the more detailed Central WebAuth process. Well, taking a look at the Central WebAuth process, here's what we see. Again, going with that high-level scenario with a client, an access point, a wireless controller, and Cisco ISE, what we see happening is this process. First of all, our client connects to the network, so they join the wireless network. At this point, the network access device, or the NAD, is going to send an access request over to Cisco ISE. Now, this is a radius message. We send a radius access request. You might recall that what ISE does is it looks at that radius request and it says, okay, is this an 802.1x request or not? And if it's an 802.1x request, is it framed IP? What is it? Is it wireless or is it wired? See, it's looking at those attributes in the radius request to determine what rule it lands on for authentication. Well, in this case, the client doesn't have any .1x running, and so ISE is going to go through those authentication rules, and at the end, it's going to find a rule that is simply configured to continue if I don't match anything. In essence, we've passed the authentication portion without ever authenticating. And the reason for this is because we don't have a means of authenticating that user yet. We could do a MAC authentication bypass, and we may have landed on that as one of our rules, and perhaps the MAB failed because the MAC address of this device is not in our database. Again, in that case, we need to be configured to continue. So continue means go on to our authorization rules. As we go through the authorization rules, we find that we don't match any of them because we don't even know who this user is, so they're not in the employee group, they're not in the contractor group, and so on. They're going to end up landing on our very last rule, which is going to be our default rule in most cases. And in a default ISE 1.2 implementation, that default rule says to permit access. Well, that's not what we want. We're going to point it to something that says redirect them to a URL for authentication. So at this point, ISE is going to pull information from the authorization profile. The authorization profile is going to have a redirect configured. It's going to say to do central web authentication. That's going to get pushed back to the controller, and the controller is now going to have the URL. And when the user tries to connect to any other URL, so they finally open a browser, what's going to happen is that controller is going to say, oh, you need to go to this URL, and it's going to send a redirect over to that user. Now the user gets redirected to our policy service node. And so the policy service node at this point, through an HTTPS connection, can provide that form that the user can enter their credentials with. So the user finally authenticates. And once they've authenticated, now ISE goes on to authorization. And then we look through our authorization rules and we say, okay, if the user is in our maybe guest database, then we're going to permit access to the corporate network or parts of the corporate network. So what ISE needs to do now, because it already went through this process once, and it already pushed down an ACL to the controller that said only allow them to talk to me, now ISE needs to send a radius change of authorization message. Now that's what COA stands for, change of authorization. And this is a method of sending a radius message back that tells that controller or switch, depending on which we're working with, but in this case, our controller, for that particular user that we had applied this access list to before, I need you to change it to this access list now. So we're changing the authorization for this user. And at this point, that user will apply that authorization policy in the form of a downloadable ACL to the controller, and the user's browser is now refreshed and it says that their authentication was successful. Now, in ISE 1.2, the user needs to enter a new URL. It doesn't redirect them to their originally requested website. However, in later versions of ISE, the ones that you're not tested on in the SISAS exam, those have the ability for you to just check a little box and say, I want you to redirect me to the appropriate URL. Okay, so that's a look at the process that takes place when we go through central web authentication. Next, we're going to go through the WebAuth configuration process, and this will include a demonstration of what it would take to set this feature up in Cisco ISE. Well, now it's time for us to get into a demonstration of central web authentication. We're going to go through the configuration process here. So as we go through this demonstration, here's what we're going to do. Well, first off, we're going to configure our Cisco switch. We're going to configure this switch with the settings that it needs ahead of time to be able to support this web authentication. Then we're going to configure MAC authentication bypass to continue, and this is a setting that we will configure in Cisco ISE. Then we're going to custom tune our WebAuth authentication sequence. We'll then configure our pre-WebAuth ACL. We'll configure our authorization profile, and we'll configure our authorization policy. So that's sort of the high-level order that we'll go through as we configure our WebAuth scenario in the lab. Let's head over to the equipment.
Well, things are going to start for us here on the admin PC. We're going to log into our ISE server. Now, ISE is pretty much set up for us for our EAP configuration and all of that good stuff. And if you're not already there with that configuration, then you'll want to view one of the previous courses in this series. But right now we're focusing on WebAuth. So we're assuming that regular authentication is already set up. We've got some endpoints in here. We're kind of already up and running. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out by configuring what's called central web authentication. We've got a little bit of configuration that we'll do on the switch and some configuration that we're going to do right here in ISE. Now if we head on over to the switch, we can do that configuration first. We are logged in here on our switch, and what we're going to do is we're going to set up the switch to do a change of authorization, or a COA. Now what COA does is it lets ISE change the authorization policy on the switch after we've seen something change in the status of a connection. So for example, when a user makes a connection and we don't know who they are, we're going to apply an authorization policy that says, wait a minute, I don't know who you are, so I need to do a guest authentication for you. After that user has authenticated, we need to go through and change the authentication status, or the authorization status, on the switch and say, okay, now they're authorized as a guest user. They're not unknown anymore. So to do that, we'll go into our global configuration mode. We're going to give it the command AAA server radius dynamic -author. Now this is going to put us into a mode, and I missed a C there, so let's just back up here and we'll add, we'll add dynamic -author. We'll add that C in there, and now we're going to tell it the ISE server that's going to be sending that dynamic authorization, change of authorization message back to it. So this is going to be client, and then the address of ISE. In our case, this is 10.10.2.20, and we have to add the server key, which is going to be used to authenticate ISE, make sure that we trust who we're seeing these messages from. Now the next thing that we want to do is set up an access list that's going to classify the traffic that'll be redirected when we do a web authentication. Now we can just create an extended access list, IP access list, let's spell that correctly, list extended, and we're going to call this ACL-webauth-redirect. And now we need to specify what traffic should be redirected. And we're going to do that with a permit statement. So we're going to permit TCP any EQ www. So web traffic will be redirected. And then let's also redirect our HTTPS traffic. Okay, now we're going to generate a key pair because we're redirecting this port 443 traffic, which means that we need to be able to deal with SSL or TLS connections, HTTPS connections. So the way that we're going to do that, we'll just type exit here. We're going to say crypto key generate RSA mod 2048. Okay, so it's going to generate that key, and then we're going to have to turn on the web server. Okay, and so now those keys have been generated. We'll give it the IP HTTP server command and the IP HTTP secure-server command. Okay, we need to save that, so we're going to do a write, and we're good to go. The next thing that we're going to do is for the port where our guest PC connects, we're going to have it provide authentication, but when we do that, we need to think about what's going to happen here. We need to have an access list applied for that basic connectivity. We're going to have it do a MAC authentication bypass first and then try .1x, but the priority is going to be to use .1x and then do MAB if .1x fails, or prefer .1x if it can. Then we're going to have it simply go authenticate at first we're not going to know who the user is. It's going to kick us into that guest access. And so let's go ahead and go into the interface where our guest PC is connected, and that's interface gig02. Okay, so we go into that interface, and first thing we're going to do is apply the access list. And we've already got that access list. If we do a show access list command here, and I got one too many C's there. Show access list. We have our basic access list already created here, and it's allowing DHCP, DNS, web traffic over to ISE, and that's it. And so, or actually that's going to be web traffic to our HQ server is, I believe, what that is in our lab environment. But at any rate, it really doesn't make much of a difference. Our web traffic is going to be redirected. We're going to allow DHCP and DNS, and we need to do this so that we can get an address and resolve names. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is set up our authentication mode for multi-auth. We're going to go ahead and do open authentication on here, and then we're going to set our order of authentication to MAB and .1x, and then the priority to .1x over MAB. Okay, and now that that's set up, we're going to have the port control happen automatically, set our authentication to periodic. We need to enable MAB on the port, and then we're going to enable the .1x PAE authenticator command and set our timeout period to 10 seconds. Okay, so gig02 is now set up, and at this point we really have everything that we need on the switch, so we can just save that configuration, and then we can head on over to ISE, and on ISE we'll go ahead and set it up for our web authentication. As we continue on here, we'll go ahead and begin by minimizing the box here. We'll click on Done, and then we need to scroll down and save. We're just saving the changes that we did just previously here. So this is saved, and we can go ahead and continue on now. So now we've got it set up so that it will continue on, and we should be all good there. Now, a couple of the things that we're going to need to do is we're going to set an ACL that's going to be downloaded. This will be a DACL, of course. We'll go to Results, and we're going to go to our Authorization, and then Downloadable ACLs. We're going to create a pre-auth or a pre-WebAuth ACL. So we'll just click Add here, pre-auth, and let's go ahead. We're going to permit DNS and DHCP. We're going to permit web traffic and ICMP traffic, and then we're going to permit TCP and UDP to ISE. And most of these are either going to be for the guest portal, the NAC agent, or for profiling. And those, we'll go ahead and drop this access list in here. I'll just talk through these. Okay, so permit boot P, so that's our DHCP. Permit our echo and our domain. Permit echo reply. Oops. And I just want to take these spaces out of here so we have a nice clean ACL. Okay. And permit web traffic. This is pre-WebAuth. And permit TCP port 443, so HTTPS traffic. Permit TCP traffic from anybody to ISE equal to 8443. And then the same thing on 8905. And then on 8909. And like I said, these are for profiling the Swiss protocol, which is used for the NAC agent, and specifically 8443 is what's used for the guest portal that we're going to be accessing. But in general, when you create these access lists, you include all these ports so that if you add NAC down the road, you don't have to go in and edit this. We also have some of these that are UDP that you'll see here at the end as well. And 8909 is the port that's used for client provisioning, and that's when we're using network admission control. That'll be in the posture course, so the ACL will already exist, but just keep that in mind. We would use that for our posturing when we use the NAC agent and the Swiss protocol. Let's check our DACL syntax. Make sure we don't have any problems with it. Looks like it's okay. Especially after pasting, it's a good idea to check that syntax. We'll go ahead and submit that. And then we're going to create an authorization policy. So we'll go up here to the authorization policy folder. We'll click on add. And we're going to call this WebAuth. We're going to select that DACL that we just created, which was called pre-auth. And we are looking at an access accept, of course. But where the magic comes in here, it's not really magic, but is with this web redirection check box here. And if I just scroll this down a little bit, it is going to do a central web authentication. And then we need to plug in the name of the ACL that we created over on the switch. Now, let's just go over to the switch. We'll log back in here. We'll do a show access list. And we want this ACL WebAuth redirect. It has to match that word for word, letter for letter, or it will not work. So we're just going to come in here and paste it so we don't end up with any typos. ACL WebAuth redirect is what's going to be used for the central web authentication. And it's not blocking traffic, it's simply defining what gets redirected. If we come down here to the bottom, we can see those attributes that have been created for us. So we have an access accept that's getting pushed back. The DACL is called pre-auth. We have that Cisco AV pair, which is a URL redirect. And the ACL that's going to be matched for the redirect is ACL WebAuth redirect. And then we actually have the URL, which is HTTPS and then IP and port. Remember that port's 8443 / guest portal / gateway / session ID. And so and then followed by a session ID value. Now that session ID is important because it's actually what ties the client's browser to the correct guest auth session in ISE. Okay, we're going to start out by saving this, so we'll hit the submit option. And now we need to go to our authorization policy, and we need to go in here and create a WebAuth policy. And we're going to do this right above the default policy, which has been modified from a permit access, which is by default, to a deny access. We're going to insert a rule above. We're going to call this rule WebAuth. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to just match a condition here. The condition is going to be network access. And the condition that we're looking to match, network access authentication status. So let's look for that in here. Right here. And what we're looking for is an unknown user. So right here, unknown user. So if the authentication status is I don't know this user, they're not authenticated, then what do? Well, our authorization profile or our permission is going to be a standard WebAuth. Okay, we're going to save this. And then we're going to come on back over here to operations and then authentications. And let's take a look at what we see here. Now we're waiting to see our device pop in, and as it does, we can see that it's just coming in as an unknown device. We are not identifying it on gig02. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go over to the switch to resolve this. And that would be our first step. So let's go over to the switch. And over here on the switch, we're going to need to log back in here because I typed the letter Q. So we'll log in. we're going to go into interface gig0/2, and we're going to shut down the port and give it just a moment here. All right, and then we're going to do a no shutdown and see if this bounces it enough to have the MAB authenticate. If it doesn't, then what we're going to do with ISE 1.2 is we're going to stop and start the ISE service. And then it should go ahead and pick up the MAB and do the push of the access list. If we come back over here, we can see nothing's really happened yet. Come back over and watch the switch, and it should be when that guest PC sends some kind of traffic, which it may not be sending traffic a whole lot, but there is stuff going on. Okay, and so we can see authentication result, no result from MAB. Okay, so in this case, since it's not responding to us, the fix for ISE 1.2 is for us to go to ISE and just stop and start the service. So we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, and now that all of those services are stopped, we'll do an application start ISE. And this is going to take just a couple of minutes, so as soon as it comes back, we'll come back in and check our authentication status. And we can do a show application status ISE and see if our services are started back up, which they're probably not yet. So they're still starting up. We can also see here in the background that we don't have any changes to that status at this point. Okay, so back here in ISE we can see that it has logged us out. We'll need to log back in. We'll go to Operations and then Authentications. Okay, and now what we can see is on gig02 we're in WebAuth. So again, this is just a little quirk with ISE 1.2. Later versions of ISE fix this, but starting and stopping the service in our lab environment seems to do the trick. And I've seen this in several different lab environments, so it's not just a one-time thing. Okay, so let's go over to the guest PC, and let's see if we can get out to Cisco.com. Okay, and all of a sudden we see we're not going to a HTTP site, but we're getting redirected somewhere. We don't have the ISE certificate installed on the guest, so that's why we saw that. And here we are, we're in the guest portal. Okay, so then at this point, let's just take a look at the switch and see what we have going on. So we're going to just do a show authentication sessions interface G0/2, and what we're seeing is authorization was successful, so we got an access accept. We have the pre-auth ACL applied, we have the ACL WebAuth redirect applied, and we are currently being redirected to our ISE port 8443 guest portal. And so right now we should be good to go. We also can see the session ID that is part of the URL here, and that session ID will be the same as the session ID for this WebAuth that's happening here. So let's go ahead and authenticate, and we're going to authenticate with a user that is in Active Directory. Okay, so we have a sales user, and we'll just authenticate with that sales user and click sign on, and we receive our acceptable use policy, and we want to accept those terms and say accept. And at this point the guest portal tells us, okay, you're signed on, you have authenticated, now go ahead and go where you wanted to go in the first place. But notice what happens when we try to get out to Cisco.com again. We're going to end up in this loop, and we're right back at it with this guest portal. Now you might be wondering why this is happening, because obviously it's not something that's supposed to happen. This is true. Ultimately with the guest portal we don't want to be in this authentication loop, but what's happening is we don't have another authorization policy that says what should happen now that we're authenticated. So we're going back into the policy, and we'll just take a look at that over here. We're going back into our authorization policy after we've authenticated as a guest. They know who we are, and so we're going right back down this list, and we're just landing again on WebAuth because, well, we don't have anywhere else to go. So really what now needs to happen is we need to have another policy that says once an employee has authenticated using the guest flow, now I want you to assign them the corp employee permission or authorization profile. Now this is real easy to do. So what we're going to do is we can find our regular employee access, and we'll just put another policy right underneath it. So here's our corp employee access, which is doing EAP chaining in this case. And we're going to insert a new rule below. And then we're just going to say this is a corp employee WebAuth. And then we'll say that the condition is, and we're going to create a new condition. And we're going to say that their Active Directory group is an employee. So let's go ahead and find that. And then we'll add another one. And in this one, the attribute that we're going to select is going to be network access. And what we're looking to see is if the use case for this network access is going to be the guest flow. That's the process that we're going to look for. All right, so now if a user is authenticated through the guest flow and they're an employee, then we're going to give them the corp employees authorization profile. And you could go ahead and create another authorization profile for this that gives them maybe a little more restricted access because perhaps they're coming in from their phone or from, whatever the case may be. In this case, this will work for us. And now we can come on back to the guest PC. Let's put this over into Operation Authentication first. Okay, and then we're doing a WebAuth. And this event was an authorize only, which was a change of authorization is what should have happened there. And so we're going to authenticate here. Okay, but what we're going to do before we go to the guest portal is we're just going to close the browser because remember that session ID is tied to another authentication session. So let's just reopen this and we'll go back here to Cisco.com. This will put us into the guest portal again. Okay, so here we are in our guest portal. And we're going to sign in with Sales1. And we're going to accept that AUP. And then we're going to go to Cisco.com again. And there we go. We have a successful WebAuth as an employee user. If we come over here to the admin PC, we can see that the authorization profile that has now been applied is corp employees. We are Sales1. This is on gig 02. And this was an authorize only, which was a change of authorization. And so we can see that they added the DACL to the authorization profile, or in the authorization profile, they added that DACL to us, push that back down to the switch, and our switch has applied it. We'll have to log back in here to see that. But if we do that show authentication session int g0/2, we can now see the success with the employee full access DACL applied. We can see that MAB was what was authenticated. So we did a MAB, we went through the guest process, we authenticated as an employee user because we did a WebAuth, and we are now able to connect. Okay, let's go ahead and review what we have covered in this module.
Well, let's go ahead and summarize what we've seen in this module. We started out with a topology review. We then did an overview of WebAuth. And we talked about how WebAuth is not only used for guest access, although it is a component of guest access. However, it is also something that we would use to provide a fallback for 802.1x. Well, then we looked at the general WebAuth process at a high level and discussed what would happen when a user connects and how they would get redirected to a portal that would allow them to provide authentication. We gave you the scenario that we would work with in a central web authentication process, and then we talked through the details that included the messages between the NAD and Cisco ISE, those radius messages, which included the access request as well as the change of authorization response that would come back from ISE to change the access list to something that permitted access to the corporate network. We also saw the configuration process. We talked through that, and when we did our demonstration, we configured WebAuth in our lab environment. So that wraps up this module, but I invite you now to join me in our next module. What we're going to do is we're going to add to our understanding of WebAuth and turn it into a guest access solution. And so in the next module, you'll see the elements that are required to turn WebAuth into a guest access solution. And then in our demonstration, we'll go ahead and set that up. Well, hi there, everyone. Welcome to Implementing Guest Services. What exactly are we going to cover in this module? Well, let's talk about that. We just looked at how to implement WebAuth in the previous module. We're going to take that and we're going to add that as one of the components to providing guest access. And so we're going to start out by doing an overview of just what the components are that are involved in guest access. Well, then we're going to overview guest access and WebAuth and how they interact with each other. So we'll see how the two of these things, guest access with web authentication, actually kind of takes place. And then we're going to get into some portals. We're going to overview the admin portal. We're going to overview the sponsor portal. We'll overview the guest portal. And then by now, you're going to be all portaled out. You'll know all the different portals that you'll need to be working with in terms of guest access. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to talk about the procedure that we would go through to configure guest access, and we'll show you a demonstration on how to set up our sponsor portal, how to access the sponsor portal, how to create a guest account, and then we'll go back in and do some WebAuth and authenticate a guest using that guest account that we've just created. Well, that's what we have ahead of us. Now, let's just overview real quick the components that are involved here in guest access. Okay, so would you believe that there are 3 main components to offering guest access? Well, there is. Let's talk about what those are. Would you also believe that you already know what one of them is? You do, especially if you've been following along with this course. The first element or component of guest access is WebAuth. We can't really provide guest access unless we perform a web authentication. Our guests, when they come onto the network, they typically don't come packaged with an 802.1x supplicant unless they're using .1x back in their own environment. But even so, they're going to fail authentication on our network. So WebAuth provides a means for us to authenticate users who are not going to pass our .1x authentication or successfully map against our network. So that's the first component of guest access with Cisco ISE. Well, what's the second component? Well, the second component is the sponsor portal. Now, what is a sponsor portal? Well, a sponsor portal is a web interface that someone in an organization can log into who's been deemed to be a sponsor of guest accounts. Now, this could be any employee if you choose to set it up that way, or it could be, for example, your lobby ambassador or your receptionist. They could have the rights to create guest accounts, and they do that inside the sponsor portal. Now, the sponsor portal is really simple. If you're the sponsor and you're just logging in, you can either create a single user account or you could create several user accounts. Maybe you're a training organization and you've got a whole bunch of people coming in for the week to take a class. Well, you can create, let's say, 16 random username and password combinations, and then you can print out each of those on a sheet of paper, leave it on the desk, and when a student comes in, they've got their own credentials for that week. So sponsor portals let you do things like that. Now, what's the third component of guest access? Well, this is a component that I've always felt kind of didn't make sense to me as being a component of guest access, but it actually is, and it's the admin portal. So how is the admin portal a component of guest access? Well, if we don't have the admin portal, we can't set up guest access. So in terms of our SISAS exam, when you think about the components of guest access, don't forget the admin portal. It's the key element of setting up guest access. We have to have an admin portal so that we can log in and set up our WebAuth and then set up our sponsor configuration. So the admin portal is what you've already been using in the other courses in this series to configure ISE. It's also the interface that we configured WebAuth in our previous module. Okay, so that's the three components of guest access. Now let's take a look at how guest access and WebAuth interact with each other. Well, now let's look at guest access and how it interacts with web authentication. So here's a bit of an overview, and the first thing you'll notice about this topology here is that we are only showing you the infrastructure to begin with. We have our corporate network, which is accessed via the wireless LAN controller. There's an access point that'll service our wireless clients, and then we have Cisco ISE. Okay, so in a guest access scenario, something has to take place before the user connects to the network. Well, what is that? Well, we have to have a sponsor, and that sponsor needs to connect to the sponsor portal, which is ISE, and then create a guest user account. So that sponsor portal is something that oftentimes people will provide a link in their company intranet. They'll make it easy for our sponsors to know how to get there. Sometimes you'll see people create a CNAME so that they can enter like sponsor.mycompany.com and then have that redirect to the PSN of ISE and the sponsor portal. And so they'll connect there and they'll create, after logging in, they'll create an account, and then that account will now be a local guest account on ISE. Now, as you set things up as the administrator, you'll get to decide how long these guest accounts are good for. And you can allow a sponsor to select between different durations or different levels of guest access. So you might provide a single day, a single hour, a single week, whatever the case may be. The sponsor can choose those, but as an administrator, it's going to be up to you to decide how that's going to be or what those values are going to be. All right, so now we have this new guest account sitting there on ISE. So now we're ready for this user to come onto the network. So they come onto the network and they open their browser. And when they open their browser, they are going to try to connect to some web page, right? They've got their home page saved. Maybe it's Google, maybe it's pluralsight.com. And so they open their browser and it tries to go to that web page. One thing I should point out ahead of time is that the access point and the controller, the way that they're configured for this guest access generally to work, is they're configured with an open SSID. Anybody can connect to it, but to get through that controller, you're going to have to authenticate. So we don't have to worry about WPA2 or any of that kind of stuff. There are scenarios where we use a single SID, and we use that single SID for employee users as well, in which case you may have WPA2 with a passphrase configured. Once they know that, then they have to authenticate as an employee. But that's not what we're talking about in terms of guest access. With guest access, we're offering this network as an open SID or an open SSID. All right, so the browser tries to connect to the web. The controller is limiting access right now and only allowing connectivity over to ISE and maybe DNS and maybe DHCP, right? Some of the just necessary things. And they're going to send a MAC authentication bypass request over to ISE because we know their MAC address when they connected to the wireless, but we don't know anything else about them. Now, ISE at this point is going to process this just like WebAuth was processed in the previous module that we looked at. So what do we mean? Well, ISE is going to send a URL redirect back because MAB is going to fail. MAB fails. It's configured to continue onto authorization. Authorization goes down through each rule, doesn't find a match, and hits our final rule that says, if the user's not authorized, then go ahead and do a WebAuth redirect. The authorization profile is configured with central web authentication. It sends a URL redirect back. The user gets that redirected web page, and then they can plug in those guest credentials that the sponsor previously created for them. So that's our process of going through guest access with a sponsor enabling the guest and then WebAuth authenticating that guest. So before we get into the configuration of this, let's talk about portals. And what you're going to see is we've got a lot of portals. So let's identify what the role of each of these portals is going to be in this guest access scenario. Well, it's time for portals, and more portals. We've got a lot of portals that we deal with in guest access. Let's talk about each one of them. We'll begin with an overview of the admin portal. Now, this is the admin portal that you know and love already. It's used to build our guest access portal. It's used to create policy in ISE, and it's also used to monitor our access attempts. So everything that we do to set up ISE on the admin side is done inside of this admin portal. It's what you've been using for everything else. What we're going to do in terms of guest access with the admin portal is we're going to go in and configure our sponsor portal. We're going to build that sponsor portal, and we're going to set up our guest access settings. Make sure that we know what a guest should do when the guest is connected. So this is what we do in the admin portal. But that's not the only portal. Remember, it's portals, portals, and more portals. The next portal to discuss is the sponsor portal. Now, this sponsor portal is a customizable portal for, you guessed it, our sponsors. Now, sponsors could be anyone. It could be a lobby ambassador. It could be a receptionist. It could be any employee who is deemed responsible enough to be allowed to create guest accounts for people who are not employees of the company. Now, this could come in different levels. What we can do is we can configure sponsor groups, and then in those sponsor groups, we'll specify per group privileges. And so that sponsor group policy that we'll create along with these sponsor groups assigns users to a sponsor group. We have this policy that puts a user into a sponsor group, and the sponsor group says, okay, this user that just logged into the sponsor portal, they're allowed to create 3 different types of users. They're allowed to create a user for 1 day, and they're allowed to create a user for 1 week. That's the only types of users, guest users, that this sponsor can create. Well, now maybe I'm someone who sets up guest access for our contractors, And our typical contract is a 6-month contract. I could sponsor that contractor as an employee and put them into a 6-month guest account by creating that for them inside the sponsor portal. But see, my sponsor group policy would have to assign me to a sponsor group that allows those privileges. So we'll see how this plays out when we get into the ISE graphical interface. But the sponsor portal is where we're going to go as a sponsor to create those guest accounts. Well, we need to set that up in the admin portal. And these are some of the things that tie into that. We customize it, we make it look the way we want it to look, we set up sponsor groups, and we set up sponsor group policies. Now, the final portal to discuss is our guest portal. This guest portal will provide an AUP page. Now, that stands for Acceptable Usage Policy. And typically, we put that on a guest network, and we have the user accept our terms to be able to gain access to the network. Well, this guest portal can also provide password change capability for the guest. Perhaps the password that we've assigned them through the sponsor portal is something that is going to be very difficult for them to remember. Well, we can allow them to change that password in the guest portal. We can also provide them with a self-registration page. Maybe we want to skip the formality of a sponsor, and we can just set up a self-registration page and say, hey, plug in all your information, and we'll create a guest account for you. Well, we can do that as well. And then finally, we can provide a device registration page. We can have them register their device so that it will pass MAC authentication bypass, or so that we can add them to a My Devices portal. And then perhaps if the user is on a longer term access in our guest portal and they lose that device or they upgrade that device and they obtain a new one with a new MAC address, well, at that point, what we can do is we can allow them to go to the My Devices portal because they've registered their devices, and they can select a device and say, I no longer have this device, delete it. Or they could say, I've lost this device, and let us know that it's lost, and then we can put that device on a blacklist. So that's the guest portal. And so those are the portals, and more portals that we'll work with as we set up guest access in Cisco ISE. Now, let's move on now to configuring guest access.
Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to go through this demonstration here in the lab. The first thing we're going to do is configure our sponsor portal settings. We need to set it up so that a sponsor can authenticate. This will be an employee, and then they're going to be able to, once they're logged in, they can provision a guest account. So we need to set up that sponsor portal first. So that's sort of a separate portal that we're going to have. We'll configure that in ISE. Then we'll log in as a sponsor. We'll provision a guest. In ISE, we need to configure our guest authorization policy. So we'll set that up, and then we're going to go ahead and test and log in as a guest and see what the process looks like. So without any further ado, let's jump into the lab and configure guest access with a sponsor portal. All right, let's go ahead and start out by taking a look at our sponsor portal settings. And so we're going to go to Administration, and then under Web Portal Management, we're going to go into Settings. And under Settings, we have a couple different folders. Now remember, these are related to our Web Portal Management, and we're going to start out by creating a sponsor portal. Now that sponsor portal, we have a couple of options. We have the authentication source. Now this is where we're going to authenticate that sponsor, and it's an identity source sequence here, sponsor portal sequence. So that's where we're going to look when we try to authenticate someone who's connecting to the sponsor portal to create a guest account. And we'll go ahead and make sure that that is authenticating where we expect it to. And then we also have these language templates in here. We can see the different languages that this sponsor portal can come in, and we're just going to leave that alone and let it go to its default, which of course it'll go based on the browser. The browser's in English, and so we're good to go. But we do have some language support here with the sponsor portal. So sponsor portal sequence is what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and look at that identity source sequence. We know that's in a different location. It's under administration, and then under identity management, it's identity source sequences. And here's our sponsor portal sequence. And so right now it's looking at the internal user database of ISE, and we wanted to actually look at Active Directory so one of our domain users can log in and provision a guest. And so we'll go ahead and save that. Okay, now let's go over here and look at our sponsor groups. Now, what is a sponsor group? Well, we have 3 default sponsor groups, and the sponsor group is going to control what a sponsor can do. And so let's just take a look for a moment here. We have sponsor all accounts, sponsor group accounts, and sponsor group own accounts. Now, if we look at the sponsor all accounts sponsor group, what you're going to see is that we have an authorization level tab, and we have several options in here. Allow login, create single accounts, create random accounts. And you'll notice yes, yes, yes. This is saying that if somebody authenticates as a sponsor and they are in the sponsor group sponsor all accounts, then this is what they're going to have the authorization to do as a sponsor. They'll be able to import CSVs. They'll be able to send emails. They cannot send an SMS. They can view the guest password. They can print the guest details. Okay, so that's what this is talking about here. We'll scroll this up. You can see the guest roles. Now we have 2 different guest roles. We have a guest and an activated guest. So what happens is there's a time profile. The time profiles, we have a couple of different ones, but default 8 hours is what's selected for the sponsor group that we're looking at right now. So as a sponsor, when I create a guest user, that guest user has 8 hours from the time they log in if they are part of the guest users guest role. If they are an activated guest, then that time starts as soon as I create the account. So there's a difference between guest and activated guest. It all has to do with that time profile. Okay, so we could look at each of these. Here's the sponsor group accounts, and we can look at their authorization levels there, what they're allowed to do. They can view and edit group accounts, suspend and reinstate group accounts. If I come back here to the list and we just look at sponsor all accounts, you'll notice they have the all accounts option. So again, it's a different privilege level as far as what they're allowed to do. Okay, and then sponsor group own accounts. And if we look at the authorization level, then they can only mess with their own account. Okay, so that's what's going on here. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign our domain admins to be able to sponsor all accounts. And so the way that we do that is we need to go to our sponsor group policy right here. And this policy is kind of like our authorization or authentication policies. And we're going to work with this manage all accounts. So we're basically saying if the identity group is sponsor all account and these other conditions apply, then the sponsor group that you're in is sponsor all accounts. So what we want to do is we want to change the identity group to any. So again, we look at how this reads. If you're in any identity group, and this is where we'll say your Active Directory external group is domain admins. So we'll select this. We'll say Active Directory external group equals select domain admins. Then you can sponsor all accounts. That puts you into that group. Okay, and then we can say, okay, sponsor group accounts. We could say that if you're in any identity group, and We'll select the same Active Directory external group. And if you are an employee, then you can sponsor group accounts. Okay. And then we can modify the own accounts, but we're not going to worry about that one. So again, this just shows you how we would set it up so that we have some policy for a sponsor. And of course, we could come over here to actions and we could insert a new rule below, and we could create our own rule if we wanted to. But this is good enough for now. We can work with the existing ones that we have here. And so at this point, we've done enough to actually connect into the sponsor portal. And so what we'll do is we'll come over here to the employee PC, and in the employee PC, we'll connect to that sponsor portal. Now the sponsor portal is accessed on port 8443/sponsor portal. All right, and we're going to want to log in here as an employee user, and as long as we're a domain admin, then we're going to be able to sponsor all accounts. So what I'll do here is I'll log in as the administrator. This way I know it's a domain admin. And we're using that identity source sequence. It's going to go look at Active Directory, so we know where we're going to get authenticated. And this should authenticate us over there. Okay, so we're logged in to the sponsor portal. And we can see that we can create an account, import accounts, we can create random accounts. Random accounts are good if you have a bunch of people coming in, you need to create 15 accounts. Individual accounts, if you have a specific guest that you need an account for, that would be fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to just create an account. And it's going to create this in the local ISE database. So I'll say my name, Brandon, Carol, and I don't really need to give anything else here. You'll notice that nothing is required. And if I come down here, it's going to look for my guest role. So remember, we had two options, guest and activated guest. So I'm just going to make myself a guest. The duration is 8 hours. We could set up different durations. You could have a week, you could have 2 weeks. These can all be done in the settings. The time zone and the language. And so we'll just leave everything at the default here. We're going to submit this. And what we're definitely going to need to do is we're going to need to take note of this password that has been assigned to B. Carol, the user. And so we can scroll down here to the bottom and we can print that, or we can go back and view those guest accounts. And now I'll get a list of all those accounts, and you'll notice he's awaiting initial login. He's not an activated guest at this point. He's just a guest. And this guest is, again, in the local database. Okay, so if we went over to our switch now, we could bounce that port where the guest PC is connected. We'll do a shut. We'll do a no shut. And this should end up provisioning it with the pre-auth ACL again. Now again, if we go through our authentication process, we'll be able to authenticate successfully and accept the AUP, but what's going to happen is we're going to end up in that loop again. And the reason we'll end up in that loop is because we don't have a policy for the guest user at this point. We need to create an authorization policy that gives them some access. So let's just see if we have that. Show authentication session int g0/2, and we can see that it's come down now. And so there we go. We're in pre-auth right now with the ACL WebAuth redirect. And before we redirect it, let's go create that policy on the admin PC. So we go back here, we go into authorization, and well, actually what we could do first is go to policy elements and let's create a downloadable ACL to apply to them. And so we need to go to results. We could create the policy, but if we don't have an ACL to apply, kind of a waste. So we'll go authorization and authorization profiles. And let's add one, and we'll just call this guest. And we're going to apply a DACL to them, and we'll just make them a full access contractor. And I don't need to push anything else down to them. That's it, because the web auth is already going to happen through our other authorization profile that's been created. Okay, so now what we're going to do is go back into our policy, authorization, and then we have a web auth rule here. And he's right here, right above the default. And let's just go ahead and put a rule in here that happens before that, of course. And we're going to say guest access. And then what we're going to say is if you are in the local ISE database, which is going to be a user identity group, and you can either be in guest or you might be an activated guest. So let's go ahead and pick that one, user identity group, activated guest. Then the authorization that I'm going to apply to you is going to be my guest downloadable ACL, which is a contractor ACL, which gives you full access. So now we'll say done. We'll save this. And let's go to operations and authentications. Okay, so we have that pre-auth ACL that's been applied right now. And let's go to the guest PC. We'll just come in here and open a new window. So we want to close that one out. We're going to go to Cisco.com again. There we can see that we've been redirected. And we're going to put in our guest user this time. We're going to assume that our sponsor has provided that to us. And hopefully you've taken note of the password. If not, that sponsor can go look at it again. And we'll sign on. Take our acceptable use policy. Now it says we can go where we intended to go before. We'll go back to Cisco.com, make sure we have access. We do. And over on our admin PC, there's that guest user B. Carroll that's authenticated. There's the contractor full access that we were provided as change of authorization happened. And then finally, if we come over to our switch, we can see we had some authorization that succeeded. And let's just do an up arrow and make sure that we have the username B. Carroll with auth Z success and that contractor full access ACL that was applied. Okay, so we have now successfully implemented guest access with a sponsor portal in Cisco ISE. Let's go ahead and review what we've covered in this module.
Well, let's go ahead and summarize what we've covered in this module. We did an overview of the components that you would see in guest access. We talked about the sponsor portal. We talked about the admin portal. We talked about how guest access as a service interacts with WebAuth, which is a service that we also set up. The two of those work together, although WebAuth is an independent functionality. We also did an overview of what the admin portal is used for, what the sponsor portal is used for, and some of the settings that needed to be configured there, and the guest portal as well. We took a look at the configuration procedure, and in our demonstration, we set up guest access, we created a user account with a sponsor, and then we went ahead and accessed the network using WebAuth to get that guest authenticated. So that's it for this module. I invite you now to join me in the next one where we're going to review the important topics that you'll want to be aware of for the SISAS exam.
Well, hello there everyone, and welcome to the course review for this ICE Guest Access course that we've been covering here. And so my name is Brandon Carroll, CCIE 23837, and let's go ahead and go through what we've covered throughout this course, and we're going to hit some of the important elements that you're going to want to remember, take note of, especially if you're planning on passing the SISAS Cisco exam. So first of all, recall that we started out with WebAuth. WebAuth was different than guest access. We're going to cover that in just a little bit, but we started out with the web authentication process, and there was something very specific that WebAuth required as part of our authentication policy. Can you remember what that was? Well, let's take a look at the ICE interface. We'll highlight it here for you. The very specific option that we had to have configured here is that we had to continue if authentication failed or if the user was not found. Now the reason is because when a guest user or someone who does not have an AnyConnect client or an EAP client connects to the network, they're going to fail authentication. And so their web browser is going to be used as an alternate means of authenticating this user. So we need to say, okay, if for whatever reason I don't know who this user is, I can't find them or they fail, let's just forget about authentication here and let's skip on to authorization. Now once we did that, we move into the authorization policy. Recall that we had to apply a downloadable ACL. Now this downloadable ACL had to happen almost immediately, and this is based on pre-authentication parameters. What we're saying is that prior to a user authenticating, we're going to redirect them to a browser, and we need to give them some access. So in this example, we permitted ICMP, we permitted web access over to www and 443, and we also permitted the 8443 and a couple other ports over to ICE. Now these ports are used for different things. This is sort of the stock standard ACL that we configure so that they can do things like posture services with the Swiss protocol if we were doing posturing. So we just created this stock DACL, but really port 8443 over to ICE is what we're going to need to be able to allow the user to talk to that redirected web page where ICE authenticates them. Now remember, we also had to make some adjustments to our authorization policy. And this was so that when we perform web authentication, we can apply that DACL and whatever other authorizations needed to be done. For example, we had to have a redirect ACL that was already configured on the switch, but we had to tell the switch which redirect ACL to use. Now all of that was configured in the authorization policy. So if we look at the authorization policy, we can see here that we had one called WebAuth, and if the authentication status is unknown, if I don't know what's going on with their authentication, then I'm going to do a WebAuth, and the WebAuth authorization profile would have had a redirect to the central web authentication portal with a redirect ACL applied, as well as a downloadable ACL, the one that we had already seen configured here, that's going to allow them. So it's important that we plug in that WebAuth ACL here so that the proper permissions get applied prior to the user getting anywhere on the network. Now, once they're authenticated, then another DACL is going to be applied. Now, so even prior to authenticating, you'll get one DACL, and that DACL that you get prior to authenticating, that would be our pre-auth ACL, and we can see that here. In fact, there's that pre-auth ACL. After authentication, we'll see this in just a bit, you'll have another ACL that'll permit whatever else you want them to get access to after they're authenticated through that web authentication portal. And even if they're authenticated as guest, we still have to apply a different DACL, something other than this pre-auth. So there's two DACLs at least that you're going to configure when you're doing web authentication. One for pre-auth and one for post-auth. Now, in addition to that pre-auth ACL, recall this is the show authentication sessions command on the switch. We also see that URL redirect ACL. And this is not a downloaded ACL. This is an ACL that is pre-configured on our Cisco switch. Now, whatever's listed in that ACL is going to be redirected to the portal or to ISE. And then in addition to that, we have that actual URL redirect, and we can see that here as well to https://ISE. Whatever our domain is. Important to understand that this is on port 8443 for the guest portal. That guest portal also has a session ID here. I didn't highlight it, but remember that session ID is unique. And so if we were to try to authenticate and things fail, and then we come back and we just try to connect again, we're going to get a new session ID when authentication starts again. And you'll also notice at the end of this URL the CWA action, Central Web Authentication. Now there's also another one called CPP, which would be our client provisioning portal. That's not what's happening here. Client provisioning is something that happens with posture assessment. This is Central Web Authentication, so it's a different action. And the way that we know which action to apply is based on our authorization profile and which type of portal we select in our drop-down there. Okay, now this authentication that we configured to begin with in the first module of this course was good for employees. But when we have an actual guest, we have to do a little bit more to get a guest authenticated, because remember, if we're integrated with Active Directory, we could be pointing to Active Directory to authenticate employees even through a web portal, but to have a guest, we need a guest account. And it's going to take a sponsor to create that guest account. Now, in our web portal management, under our settings, we have an authentication source. And this is where we get a differentiation between WebAuth and guest services. So with guest services, we create sponsor configurations for a sponsor portal, and that sponsor has to be authenticated. And they're going to be authenticated using this identity store sequence. Now, the identity store sequence, sponsor portal sequence, in our lab exercise, we edited this so that it went to Active Directory and said, hey, let me go to Active Directory and look for an admin. And the admin can then create guest accounts. But the sponsor group policy is where that's controlled. So you have to be matched to a sponsor group policy to be able to sponsor accounts. And there are 3 default sponsor group policies: manage all accounts, manage group accounts, and manage own accounts. Now the key to making this work is that we have to change the identity group right here from sponsor all account. We're not looking to see if the user's in that identity group to be able to sponsor. We need to point them to Active Directory. So when we click on that plus, we're going to change the identity group to go look at Active Directory. So we're going to say if the user is in our AD1 server domain admins, then they can sponsor all accounts. Okay, so that got us going with that guest portal. Now, in addition to that, the user had to, or the sponsor in this case, had to know the URL of the sponsor portal. This isn't something that they get redirected to. They actually have to browse directly there. Now, a lot of people will put a sponsor portal link in their intranet because most people know how to get to the intranet, and then they could just click on that to create a sponsor account, and it'll take them to this page here. But essentially, it's the URL of our ISE policy service node, port 8443/sponsor portal. And that's going to be key. If they don't know how to get there, they're not going to be able to create those guest accounts. Once they log in here, they'll be able to generate a single guest account or generate several accounts, do sort of a batch creation of accounts. Now, remember, in addition to this, we also need a guest policy that allows access after the user is authenticated. So here we're creating another authorization profile. This is not for the sponsor. This is for their guest that they're going to create. And then that guest policy gets applied if the condition that we match is an authenticated guest in the identity store. And we see that here. we're modifying the guest access policy, and we're saying if the user that's authenticating is a guest, if they're in the local guest identity store, then our authorization profile that we apply will be that guest profile that we just created that applies the permit all downloadable ACL. So there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to guest access, but it all branches off of the web authentication configuration that we configured in our first module. So guest is what we're looking for, the guest identity group. It's a local identity group, and anytime a sponsor creates a guest account, they get put into that local identity store. Now, just a couple other points to summarize. WebAuth and guest services are two different things. Now, WebAuth was the process of using our browser that a user gets redirected to a certain portal with to authenticate. Guest access makes use of that redirected portal, that captive portal that a user gets authenticated with, but it requires that a sponsor create their guest account. Now, the purpose of the guest service sponsor portal is going to be to create and manage our guest user accounts. So batch create several accounts, create a single user account, be able to send them their password, that type of thing. We have to have ISE set up as a policy services node, and we also need to have session services enabled in our deployment to be able to provide guest access. Now, in a distributed deployment, ISE can operate as an admin node, or a monitoring node, or a policy service node, or could have multiple roles. The policy service node is where guest access is going to be handled. And then one other thing to point out is that in our switches, we have to enable IP HTTP server and IP HTTP secure server so that we can use HTTPS. And that way, whenever a user gets redirected, the switch knows how to handle that redirected web request. So again, there's a lot of moving parts to guest access and to web authentication, but we've gone through the process here in this course, and by now you know all the elements that are required to successfully configure WebAuth and guest access, and all of the important topics that you could be tested on in the SISAS Cisco exam. Thanks for joining me in this course. Again, I'm Brandon Carroll, and I look forward to having you join me in another course, perhaps the next course in sequence, to help you work towards the SISAS exam.